Your Honor, this case involves accusations that should have never been made and certainly not directed against my client, Dr. Helen Campbell. These charges are an attempt to censor alternative perspectives and to constrain a critical examination of important issues in the field of education.
Your Honor, the state will show that Dr. Campbell has blatantly... For the record, Dr. Smith, please describe your current position and the reason for your testimony here today.
I am the chair of the federal panel responsible for compiling and analyzing scientific evidence related to the teaching of reading. I have analyzed Dr. Helen Campbell's curriculum for its use of scientific methods and approaches.
Please describe the panel and its membership.
The panel was established in 1997 through federal legislation entitled the Reading Excellence Act. The 12 members of the panel analyze and review reading research in accordance with federal guidelines.
And how is reading defined according to the guidelines in this act?
Reading is defined as a system of meaning derived from print, which requires phonemic awareness, decoding, fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension.
Based on your examination of Dr. Campbell's curriculum, does her definition of reading comply?
No. She discusses competing views and those which are contradictory to the definition.
Dr. Smith, what is your background in literacy education?
I have a doctorate in education with a specialization in child development.
But you are not specialized in reading.
No, not specifically.
Your panel, however, is interested in influencing classroom reading practices. Is that correct?
Yes, we are interested in proven, scientifically based practices.
So members on your panel would need to have knowledge in various forms of research and reading as well as classroom teaching practices.
Yes, of course.
Dr. Smith, how many members on your panel have elementary teaching experience?
I'm not exactly sure of the numbers.
Your Honor, I am in receipt of documents that show that in fact none of the members of the panel have any elementary teaching experience, and few have themselves researched reading. Dr. Smith, does your panel represent the larger research community or a certain subset of that community?
I suppose it depends on how you define research.
So one might argue that your panel represents a certain kind of research.
Yes.
Is Dr. Helen Campbell's kind of research represented on that panel?
No, and it should not be. Her research is not sufficiently systematic, reliable, or unbiased.
Standards set by your panel?
Standards set by the field of investigation and validated by our panel.
Which deny equally reliable forms of research governed by other panels. Dr. Smith, thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Dr. Parrish, you are the editor of the Journal of Research in Literacy Education. Please describe for us this journal.
Our journal publishes scholarly research articles.
Is your journal consistent with the definition of scientific reading research?
We publish articles consistent with those standards.
Have you published Dr. Campbell's work?
Yes.
Does her research meet the standards?
I would not compare it to those standards. It's really a different kind of research.
Please answer the question.
No.
Dr. Parrish, are we to understand that your journal publishes a range of research?
Yes.
So you don't restrict your journal to articles that meet the scientific standard as it has been described here?
No.
Are articles that don't meet the scientific standard considered less valid?
We don't think so. There's a range of definitions for the meaning of scientific research.
So Dr. Helen Campbell's research satisfies your definition?
Yes, as well as many of our reviewers.
Thank you.
Dr. Lambert, you were involved in the development of the definition of scientifically based research when you chaired a group to review it. Dr. Dunn, what is the relationship you have with the accused?
I'm the assistant dean of the College of Education. And
Ms. Marshall, what is your relationship to Dr. Campbell?
She was my university professor, and she helped prepare me.
Dr. Williams, can you tell us what is your relationship to Dr. Helen Campbell?
I do not know her personally, but I was asked to review her research papers before appearing here today.
Dr. Lambert, how was membership of this committee determined?
Well, I nominated individuals.
Was the group representative?
We all supported those kinds of definitions.
So are there members of the larger ERAA who might disagree with those kinds of definitions?
Perhaps, but that would defeat the purpose.
Defeat the purpose?
defeat unanimity. I wanted a group that could agree.
Did any members of the group have connections to commercial publishers or businesses that may have profited from these current definitions of reading or scientific research?
I have no clue.
You are not aware of any such affiliation?
No, not personally.
No further questions.
Were you aware that Dr. Campbell was including material that was inconsistent with the Act and with the definition?
No, but it came to my attention after some time.
How did you become aware?
I received complaints from students. They were upset that they had not passed the assessment test for teacher knowledge because Helen had not covered the material. Naturally, I was concerned.
Dr. Dunn, I appreciate the difficult position that you must find yourself in. Do faculty members usually include in their course materials that vary from the state guidelines?
Indeed, they usually cover more material than the state guidelines suggest.
Does Helen Campbell's approach help her teachers become more critical of research and the definitions of reading?
Possibly.
Do you consider the test of teacher knowledge to be comprehensive?
No, no test can be.
So an excellent teacher could perform poorly on the test. Someone like yourself, for instance.
I don't know. Possibly.
Dr. Dunn, are you aware of the university guidelines for academic freedom?
I believe I am.
Let me refresh your memory. Section A reads, teachers have the freedom to discuss material that is relevant to the subject matter as defined by the course syllabus. And in B, it asserts that teachers have the responsibility to encourage students and colleagues to engage in free discussion and inquiry. Does this policy apply to Dr. Helen Campbell?
Yes.
So Dr. Helen Campbell has the right to discuss materials that she deems relevant, and in fact, she has the responsibility to encourage free discussion and inquiry.
Well, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn.
Ms. Marshall, how well did your students perform on the proficiency test in your district? How many fourth graders failed to pass this test?
Approximately 45% of the students in my school failed the test last year.
How well did they perform the year before?
The same or a little less.
Is your school enlisting any special programs to help your students do better on this test? And if so, what are they?
The district has adopted a new program which is closely aligned to the test. We are now required to teach.
Is this program considered a best practice?
The district thinks so, but I don't consider it to be.
Did Dr. Campbell contribute to your distrust of this test?
She encouraged us to think of other
No further questions.
Can you describe for us what are your interests precisely?
Much of my research focuses on how ideas are represented. We can consider this the rhetoric of research. That is to say, I like to examine researchers' tendencies to give the impression that their research is objective through the language they use.
I don't understand. I assume that objectivity in research is either present or not.
Objectivity is not straightforward. Language plays a substantial role in determining whether or not research is objective.
You are speaking of the art of persuasion.
Not unlike that of the art of law.
Touché. Do you consider Helen's work to be true science?
I disagree that there's any form of true science. Historically, the notion of true science has been used by one group of individuals, mostly psychologists, to distinguish their work from the work of others. I believe that there are many forms of science and that Dr. Campbell uses one of them.
How would you describe the discrediting of Dr. Helen Campbell's research on the basis that it is non-scientific?
Declaring oneself as scientific and another group as non-scientific is a way of reinforcing one group's power over the other.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for your candor. Dr. Layton, you are a well-respected professor at State University. You are president of the ABC. Can you tell us your views on recent developments in reading research?
Yes, at ABC we have 40,000 members who are involved in both professional development and research initiatives. Our views on such matters as high-stakes testing, the selection and imposition of best practices, and the Reading Excellence Act is simply that they are wrong-headed. In fact, ABC has developed several resolutions to address concerns over federal and state agendas.
Doctor, can you describe for us these resolutions?
Yes, the resolutions state that we do not support the idea that any Congress or state legislative body can mandate a particular methodology for the teaching of reading, either in classrooms or in teacher preparation programs. Rather, we feel that learning is enhanced through multiple perspectives and experiences. We have, in fact, 2 recent resolutions strongly opposed the use of high-stakes testing. And we are particularly opposed to the use of such tests as the sole determinant of students' progress.
Doctor, can you tell us what your position is on the Reading Excellence Act?
Our organization has serious concerns about such committees as the reading panel, who tend to represent only dominant research groups. Without alternative perspectives, the reading panel is simply reinforcing the dominant culture and silencing diversity.
Thank you, Doctor.
Dr. Layton, was it not your organization that pushed for supporting standards in language arts and reading? Wouldn't you consider standards of this nature supporting a dominant culture?
Yes, I would.
Are you not contradicting your earlier statement by opposing the standards set by the reading panel? Are you suggesting that we should now drop standards and not expect teachers to be accountable?
I don't believe that I am. Standards themselves do not impose dominant cultures. I believe that standards should inform teachers and students, but they should not be used as prescriptions for practice. The current use of standards in high-stakes assessment have created a form of test-driven teaching. And in terms of accountability, it's the legislation of certain practices over others that undermines teachers' professional judgment.
Should teacher preparation courses ensure that prospective teachers know the reading and language arts standards?
They should examine them critically.
Dr. Campbell, how would you describe your research?
My research draws on various perspectives to understand literacy, learning, and teaching. I am constantly refining my views of how readers and writers are positioned by the texts they read and the instruction that they receive.
Help us to understand your position.
Constructivism suggests that we will never have findings that can be generalized to every learner and every situation. And it questions traditional notions of objectivity. It also represents a shift towards research that engages teachers and students in the process of research. My work includes examinations of whether or not traditional research practices, such as what the National Reading Panel espouses, are ethical, and if such definitions might support certain kinds of individual and political agendas.
What is your view of some practices being regarded as best practices or practices that teachers are expected to implement?
Best practices are quite problematic for a number of reasons. While there may be certain elements from different practices that might enrich teachers, we should not assume that there are prepackaged solutions to fit the needs of all students.
How does this relate to these charges?
My goal is to provide teachers with an understanding of how to develop and adjust practices to meet various students' needs. I have a kind of Hippocratic oath similar to medical doctors in that I am first and foremost committed to learners. To do otherwise would be akin to malpractice, and I view the non-critical examination of practices to be malpractice.
Are there other ways that best practices are problematic?
Some best practices are, well, they don't work for non-mainstream students or students from diverse backgrounds. And in fact, some best practices actively disadvantage students with English as an additional language or who don't share the same cultural capital as their teachers. Best practices, or the idea that there is such a thing as a practice for all, is something I've asked my students to question. I also want them to question how the overregulation of teaching affects the professionalism of teachers.
Why are these matters of such a concern?
I feel it's a teacher's responsibility to enhance the opportunities for all students. The reform practices that districts and states adopt can contribute to or alleviate particular problems. We've recently seen some of the fallout from the most recent wave of educational reform. Fewer than 40% of students from urban cities are graduating from high school. 15 years ago, we graduated twice as many. I want my students to at least question these developments.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell.
Dr. Campbell, do you agree that your research and teaching failed to meet the regulations defined by the guidelines? Regulations, I might add, to which you are accountable?
Yes, however,
Did your university reprimand you for your failure to abide by these regulations?
Yes.
Do you disagree with the reprimand?
Yes.
The prosecution rests, Your Honor.
Does the defense have any further questions?
Yes, Your Honor, I do. Dr. Campbell, in your opinion, where did you go wrong? What brought these allegations against you?
Professional blindness. I see my work as making the invisible visible for my students. So much of what we do in research and in teaching depends on whether or not we can question our own practice. Ethically, we are obligated to do so, but practically speaking, when economy and politics are at stake, questioning gets in the way of the blind march of progress.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. You may step down.
Defense now rests.
In that case, I would ask that the prosecution begin its closing statement.
Your Honor, we have a duty to our children to ensure that their guardians are responsible caregivers. Teachers and teacher educators are amongst our children's most important guardians, and their behaviors must be scrutinized in order to ensure that our children are given access to the care and support that they deserve. This is particularly relevant in terms of literacy education. Our teachers and teacher educators are responsible for teaching in ways that support literacy development as outlined in the Reading Excellence Act. Dr. Campbell is a teacher educator who failed to exhibit the behaviors that are in the guidelines outlined in the Act. In spite of the defense attorney's criticisms of the reading panel and of the definition of reading and of scientific research, the Reading Excellence Act is widely upheld. Support for it came from the White House, the Department of Education, and the National Institute of Health. Now, the state requires that all teacher education programs prepare teachers in the practices aligned with this Act. These guidelines are not capricious. They are derived from the National Reading Panel's guidelines, and it is charged with examining all the scientific evidence. The defendant's behavior was premeditated, self-serving, and lawless. Her actions have been shown to be worthy of reprimand and to fail to meet the needs of teachers for certification. Dr. Campbell's teaching has inhibited teachers' abilities to meet the needs of their students. This case involves a situation where Dr. Campbell has stepped outside the bounds of academic freedom. While the university policy affords academic freedom, responsibilities come with that privilege. In the public interest and in the interest of students, Dr. Campbell was obliged to follow the guidelines for teacher education determined by the state. Clearly, she did not do this. To ensure that all students have access to the best teaching practitioners. It is essential that we ensure that non-validated, unscientific work undertaken by educators such as Dr. Campbell are kept out of teacher practitioner education programs in this country. Dr. Campbell's criticisms of these practices should have remained her personal and private concern.
Your Honor, we are here today to question the professional integrity and behavior of an established scholar. Dr. Helen Campbell is brought before you by government mandates that call into question not only her professional judgment, but the very essence of academic freedom. Let us speak for a moment of ethics. Should professionals be tied to definitions and methods that arise from legislation, particularly if that legislation represents only the special interests of a dominant subgroup? Literacy represents the foundation of democracy in our society, and I would argue that it is too important for us to simply accept unexamined definitions and methods. Helen is accused of being a saboteur, when in fact, she has demonstrated a commitment to her ethical obligations. In her testimony, she speaks of abiding by a Hippocratic oath, and let us not mock her for this. Would we say the same of our legislative bodies? The stakes involved today are far greater than just a breach of contract by Dr. Helen Campbell. Control of literacy in this nation carries with it tremendous political clout and significant economic advantages for the members of that federal panel. Suspend Helen Campbell's duties at the university and all contributions to the critical examination of that which we hold fundamental to public education will be effectively silenced. I plead with you to consider the implications involved in this case. Let us not undermine teacher educators and their ability to utilize their professional judgment by choosing to accept simplistic understandings of reading and research. Dr. Helen Campbell has an ethical obligation and a legal right to raise the critical awareness of the teachers in her classroom. When you consider your verdict, I ask you, Your Honor, to think of your own child or another child that you know, and ask yourself, does this child deserve a teacher who has been trained to trust in his or her own professional development? And if your answer is yes, then I respectfully say this is an open and shut case. Dr. Helen Campbell has always represented the best interests of the students in her university classroom and the children throughout our public education system. She deserves to be applauded for her efforts, not to be condemned for what is right and true. Thank you.